Welcome to another episode of Grace on Tap. Grace on Tap is a podcast dedicated to the history and the theology of the Lutheran Reformation, all over a nice cold beer.
I'm Evan Gaertner.
And I'm Mike Yagley.
Welcome to Grace on Tap. This episode of Grace on Tap begins a new cycle of episodes for us. Instead of focusing on documents or theologians, we're going to be focusing on people during the Reformation who were not the theologians, but still had an instrumental part in shaping the direction of the Reformation.
And to kick that off, what we're going to be doing is probably, I think, the most consequential person of the Lutheran Reformation that was not directly a theologian. Actually, he was a Roman Catholic his whole life. Was Frederick the Wise.
Frederick the Wise was the noble of Saxony, where Wittenberg was, where the Reformation kind of has its seat. In this episode and the episode after this, you're going to hear a lot about the Frederick the Wise's family, the Wettin, W-E-T-T-I-N.
Yeah. We might go back and forth on that. I think the proper pronunciation is Wettin.
Yeah, so the Wettin family is old. They have that kind of noble legitimacy in this area, even at the beginning of the millennium.
I think that Frederick the Wise. So he's Frederick III, but they restarted every time they went to 3. So there was Frederick the First, Second, Third, and then Fred the First, Second, Third, and so.
And this noble family had significant. He's the sixth. He had significant control over this area, and the history of Frederick the Wise's control of the area could go back 1,000 years. We're not going to do that, but we are going to go back just a generation before him, because his father and the Albertine and Ernestine lines is kind of the interesting part of all of this.
And that's actually going to come hugely in play as we're talking about what's going down in Luther's world, the kinds of things Frederick is worried about, and that drove a lot of his just basic decision making. All of this is going to be based here in the U.S. There's really only one book that I could find that was really about Frederick the Wise, and that's Frederick the Wise: Seen and Unseen Lives of Martin Luther's Protector by Sam Wellmen.
So Sam Wellmen, this maybe 10 years ago was published, and he had the woman that had written the ultimate biography in Germany before she passed away looked at his copy to make sure he didn't have any big errors as he brought his book into English. So let's look at birthdays.
So, yeah, we'll start off with Frederick was born January 17th, 1463 in Torgau.
Second-born child, but first-born son of parents Elector Ernst and Elizabeth. So now you heard that name Ernst, and earlier I talked about the Albertine and Ernestine lines. And so Ernst's father, Frederick, things are going great, and he thinks Ernest, and Albert are going to rule together, but there's conflict. And we'll talk more about that conflict. But just catch that name, Elector, Ernst, and Elizabeth.
So there are, 7 kids in his family? He's the second. He had a sister born in 1461. He had Ernst, was his younger brother was Ernst, named after his uncle in 1464. Then Albrecht,
who's going to be a bishop in Magdeburg later.
Yep. And John, or Johann, who's going to be play a big role in Luther's day. He's sort of Frederick Part 2 in a way, and we'll be talking about that down the road. And then the youngest is Marguerite, born in 1469.
So the year after Frederick's birth in 1463, Ernst, Frederick's father, becomes the Elector of Saxony.
And much of the politics of Saxony during this era was sort of colored by the Brothers' War, and that's a whole. Now that was, I think, Ernst's father and his uncle got into a war, which is like weird, I guess, and so this was the
Frederick and Wilhelm.
Yeah, and so they got into this war. And again, we'll talk about this coloring as how that played out, because this was something, at least from Sam Wellman's book, it sounded like that was always in the back of Ernst's mind, Frederick's father, and part of the reason that things turned out the way they did. And we'll touch on that in a minute. So,
now, as a part of that war, there was a time when Frederick's father was supposed to have this knowledge of how to speak Latin and talk to the emperor, and everything was supposed to work out, and it didn't work out because his Latin was clumsy. And so Ernst comes back, and he's like, my kids are going to learn Latin. And
so what he did was he created what was called the woman's court, or the women's court. And the women's court was set up with his mother and his wife, who were very good with languages. And the idea was that they were going to teach these kids up until they were 10, 15 or something, and really have them, rigorously taught different languages, especially Latin, because he did not want his children to be embarrassed like he was embarrassed when the time came for him to speak in Latin. To the Pope, what was it, Pope Sexton, I think, or there was a...
Pope Sixtus IV.
Sixtus.
They were supposed to speak in Latin, language of educated people, but Ernst's Latin was terrible. So Frederick is that next generation that's going to sound smart. At least they're going to know their Latin. And as we look at Frederick's education, we look at this kind of environment that Frederick's being raised up, it is always be ready to be able to speak in front of the emperor.
Yeah, yeah. And the relationship with the emperor. Now, if Germany during this era, I guess probably the way I'm thinking about it, and maybe Evan, you can correct me, but reading through this, it's almost like the United States prior to the Civil War, where the states were, people would say, I'm a Virginian. They would say, I'm a Virginian before I'm an American.
Yeah, no one said I'm a member of the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
I'm a member of Saxony. I'm a member of the Palatine. I'm a member of all these different areas. And the Holy Roman Emperor would also include Spain and the Netherlands and other areas that weren't identifiably German.
But the Holy Roman Emperor didn't really have as much, because it has much clout with like Spain or with France, because they were more they were more cohesive. And in Germany, you had all these like small states that were always sort of at each other's throat, which really strengthened the emperor in that area specifically.
So Frederick's being raised to be equipped to be a knight, to be someone that's going to speak in front of the emperor. He is being raised to be noble.
Right. And it's important, like we said, like Evan said a moment ago, it's important for him to get the most for his people to be able to speak with the emperor. That's like having the leader of, again, Virginia in 1780 being able to has to speak a different language to the president. You want to be able to talk the same language, and it's very important to be able to do that to really make the most for your people.
Frederick wasn't just educated in Latin and to be the academic in front of the emperor, though. He was supposed to be a knight. He was supposed to joust. He was supposed to represent the vigor of the land and not just the academics of the land.
And I don't know if we captured it in the notes here, but there was like this list of what was expected of a knight in that era. And it was stuff like generosity, loyalty. It was almost like the Boy Scouts, what the Boy Scouts said when I was a kid, And it was this, but it was actually not a bad model for like a healthy masculinity, and so part of this was jousting, was being able to fight, and it was like this sort of era that when you were a prince, that you had these expectations that you would be. And the big one that ended up playing out a lot was the generosity one, because these guys blew through money like crazy, and that had repercussions, political repercussions for all these people. But we'll get into that in a few minutes.
Also during this time, Ernst and Frederick's uncle Albrecht was very close, literally raising the children together. And over the next several years, they are going to have a falling out, ending the common household in 1482 when Frederick was 19. When he was 20, more things happened, though.
Yeah, so his brother, his 17-year-old brother, Albrecht, and his mother died, probably of the plague. And for the rest of his life, Frederick was terrified of the plague. He'd go into a joust. He would do all this death-defying stuff, but when it came to the plague, he was totally freaked out by that. And it's understandable. I mean, it took out, 2 members of his family that he loved when he was at a relatively young age.
So these guys are starting to get into adulthood, and we had 4 sons to start with. Frederick's going to be the elector. Ernst is going to be the Archbishop of Magdeburg. Actually, he was already named that when he was 11.
At 11 years old. It's like...
And Albrecht dies of the plague. And then the 4th son, John, his identity, his path forward isn't so clear. And so Frederick and John are going to end up doing a lot of things together. Frederick is never going to have any children. John does have children. And Frederick, he does have children, but they're not a part of the noble line because his mistress, Anna, he is someone he never marries.
So to understand the relationship between Frederick and John, we probably should take a moment and take a step back to the relationship between Ernst and Albrecht.
Yeah, so Ernst and Albrecht
was it Albrecht?
Yeah, so Ernst and Albrecht, or Albert, we could also call. So we got the Ernestine and the Albert lines. This is the moment when I think we can step into these 2 lines. So the Wettin house had Saxony as electors, common property, common dukes, a bunch of great stuff was happening. And then you get this Treaty of Leipzig, and they're separated. And you separate the electoral power into Ernest, and you separate kind of the wealth into Albert. And this is going to shape things up through 1554, that you have this struggle between the Ernestine line and the Albert line. And the Ernestine line gets the electoral vote, and the Albert line gets a lot more wealth for a while, it seems.
And it's unclear why this happened. I mean, like we said earlier, Ernst and Albert were tight. They were really, really tight. And then there was some sort of falling out that they had. Now, the way these families were structured, everybody had a job to do. All the men, all the boys had a job to do.
You'd become a bishop, you'd become a knight, you'd become the elector-elect, you'd become something. And maybe this was part of the struggle, is that Ernst and Albert were too similar.
Well, Ernst was the elector, and Albert was the warrior.
But they were ruling together.
They were sort of like John, sort of like what we see later with John and Frederick.
But it didn't keep cohesion for these 2 guys. And so it got separated. So as we start talking about these guys, you'll hear about Elector Saxony and Ducal Saxony. And Electoral Saxony is going to be Ernst and Frederick and John, and Ducal Saxony is going to be Albert and
is it George?
The Ducal Saxony. And then it's going to kind of flip when we learn about Maurice or Moritz. And he's going to flip it, and he's going to side with the emperor in the Smalcald League, and he's going to get the electoral power, and then the Ernestine line is going to become the ducal power. So it's going to flip after Luther dies.
Okay.
But for now, Electoral Saxony is Frederick the Wise's family. Ducal Saxony is someone else's family. And this starts to maybe shape the way Frederick and John are trying to figure out how they're going to relate, because they know that their father and their uncle, something happened where their whole kingdom becomes divided and power is split and allegiances are split. Are Frederick and John going to have the same falling out?
Well, and this gets back to the Brothers' War. So Frederick saw his grandfather fight with his brother, his great uncle, and then he saw his father fight with his uncle. And now he's got the same situation with John, where they have to, and I think Frederick really made a priority of being tight with John.
And I wonder if that's why he never gets married, to have his kids' legitimacy be a part of things. And John, who gets married and has kids, knows that his children are going to inherit the electoral power. I wonder if that's one of the things Frederick that does. Why doesn't he ever marry Anna? I'm not sure.
Yeah, Frederick is an interesting person, because as we go through this, we'll see that he always puts his people first. He always puts the people of Saxony first. And he makes some pretty big sacrifices. He never said that's what he did, but I thought the same thing. I'm thinking he is really interested in keeping the peace and keeping things cool between him and John.
Just an example of how much they got along together. Frederick and John hosted a massive feast highlighted by a 20-course meal that included the subtleties such as having live birds fly out of a pie, music, dancing, and gambling.
I can only imagine having some great pie, open it up, and birds come flying out of it.
I've seen that in some movies, so I think it must be a part of that like majesty and magicalness of medieval
I guess none for me, thanks. It's like anyway. So yeah, you have this sort of and that was the first Reichstag, right? That was Frederick's first Reichstag.
The Reichstag is going to be this gathering of the German nobles where a lot of decisions are made. It is in 1487 at that Reichstag that Frederick is named the Elector. So his father has passed away. And now as we talk about the power of electors, let's take a moment to explain how they work.
So the electors, there were actually different levels of Well, there were the electors.
7 electors.
There are 7 electors, but then there's...
What are they electing?
They're the 7 guys who elect the emperor.
Yeah.
So
every time there's a vacancy in the Holy Roman Empire,
right.
These guys get together and they elect.
Right. But there were 3 curiae that were like 3 levels of the votes for just the running of the empire. And so there was the electors were the first ones. Then there was the curia of the princes, and then there was the curia of the imperial cities, I think was what it was. And so you had like these 3 levels, and so the idea was like it would work almost like an upper house, a lower house.
And then an even lower house.
Yeah.
And if some big decisions were made, you would have the 7 electors meet, then you'd have the princes meet, and once agreement was reached with the princes, they would all vote together, and sometimes would then freeze out the imperial cities because you'd have 2 of the 3 curiae agreeing.
Right, and that was pretty much the way they always did things. So and they were always freezing out the imperial city. I think there were like 60 imperial cities.
The imperial cities had the ability to kind of run their own power and not be ruled by another noble.
Yeah. So there were 250 non-electoral princes, which seemed like I was sort of surprised by that number. But they were all sort of, I'm going to say, led by like 3 or 5.
They're lined up in allegiances to different electors.
Well, not to the electors. There were like princes that were like the top princes. Like in this case, it would be Albertine. Mm-hmm.
So Ducal Saxony.
Ducal Saxony would be one of those princes, and so because he was so powerful, the other princes would sort of line up behind him, and there were like 2 or 3 different, maybe 5. Different powerful princes that the other 250 would sort of line up with, and then they sort of worked. They'd work out their group, then everybody would get together with the electors, the 7 electors. They'd all come to an agreement, and then just bowl over the cities. The cities really were useless.
So Frederick's going to see it's very important that he maintains his role as that first-rank prince in the empire as an elector. He's going to have imperial benefits like land and money and influence to further strengthen his ability to protect his inherently weak portion of Saxony. What makes it inherently weak is it doesn't have a lot of wealth. There's not a lot of mining. There's not a lot of academics. There's just not a lot that keeps his area of Saxony powerful except for his political power.
So there were really 3 things that a prince was really... that said, hey, I'm a powerful prince. I'm a great prince. One was having something really holy there, like a really holy site or something. That was one. Another one was having like great castles, great buildings, and I forget what the third one was.
Maybe an army.
Maybe I have it here in the notes someplace, but Yeah, there were these three things that had to be there, and Frederick really didn't have any of them. He was sort of hurting there. He didn't, in electoral Saxony.
He didn't have a college.
He didn't have. Oh, that's what it was. A college was the third one.
College. Okay, so the relics, the college, and the castles.
Right.
1487, he's named elector. 1488, it's a pretty important year for Frederick in his efforts to strengthen his position. He's helping free King Maximilian, the son of Emperor Frederick, from prison in Brussels.
So this is you have Emperor Frederick, which is Maximilian's father. And everybody knows that Maximilian is going to be the next emperor once Frederick.
Even though there's an election.
Even though there's an election.
You're not going to leave this family.
Right. It's already worked out. That was one of the things that Emperor Frederick had worked out, was that Maximilian was going to be the next emperor. So Frederick the Wise came in and negotiated the freedom of Maximilian. Now, he didn't get anything really from the emperor, but Maximilian always appreciated it.
You got some chips now, Frederick.
He got some chips.
You got Maximilian out. When he becomes emperor, he's going to remember that. So about this time, Frederick is also now thinking about, let's talk about the three things. Castles, he's got some of those.
But they're all pretty bad. None of them are really impressive by that era.
How about the holy stuff? He does have some holy stuff.
He has a few things, but it's been overlooked for like 300 years.
So let's get into what's going on in Wittenberg. This is something that I hadn't known before looking this up, but that in 1346, in 1346, Pope Clemens VI had decreed the castle church in Wittenberg to be a relic center, subordinate only to the Pope. That means it wasn't under the control of any bishop.
Right. Unfortunately, nobody really did anything with that. So there was this decree that said that this location is supposed to be a relic center that people will take pilgrimages to, and it'll be. This is the second thing. Remember, the first one was having good castles. Second one was to have a holy site. And so they've got the paperwork for a holy site, but nobody's ever done anything with it.
So in 1488, the Wittenberg Small Collection of Relics, it held 200 kind of high quality relics of Christ, like a thorn from Christ's crucifixion crown, along with relics of famous saints like the bones of Saint Wenceslas. We're going to just set aside the topic of relics.
Yeah. Well,
it's important to Frederick.
It's important to Frederick, and it actually comes into play in the politics of the era. Like we said, this is Frederick's this is his play to have a holy site in his land. He needed a holy site in his land. You have, the Notre Dame. You have these other places
because if you have relics, you have people who are going to come visit them.
Right.
And pilgrimage brings trade. It brings tourism.
Right.
And people are going to make donations, and they're going to make endowments. They're going to make gifts to this castle church so that in perpetuity there will be prayer said at this altar, which is near this relic.
And indulgences.
And then indulgences are going to get involved.
And you get indulgences come in.
Before we take a step into 1489, let's take a beer break.
Sounds good. So today's beer is a gift beer, right?
Yeah, so Dave Bainey has got some family that actually owns this brewery, the Cadillac Straits Brewing Company in Madison Heights, Michigan. And Dave donated this beer a little bit ago for us to try out on this podcast. It's an Oktoberfest beer, and it's got a wonderful caramel color.
So I've been sipping on this as we set up our equipment here.
Yeah.
And it's a really good beer. Now, this is where Madison Heights, Michigan is where I grew up. This is my old stomping.
So you got to find this brewery now.
I've actually went there.
You've been there, okay.
I've been there, of course. And so this is actually really good. I was reading, there weren't a whole lot of, it's a small brewery.
Yeah, it's in a little bit of a strip mall, pocket park kind of place.
Yeah, and you go and you try and find reviews of it online, and there wasn't a whole lot written up on it. But I'll tell you, this is a really good Oktoberfest beer. It's nice, it's smooth, it's got a lot of flavor to it. I really am enjoying this one. So
enjoy this beer break. Thank you, Cadillac Straits Brewing, for giving us an opportunity to try this beer.
And if you get a chance, I don't think they're selling it right now.
No, they're not selling it right now, but they have other great beer. They recently had some power problems with their cooling system, and so, but they're back to serving beer again.
Okay, well, if you get a chance, hopefully, if you wait until October of 2025 or later, or September of 2025 or later, maybe you'll be able to pick some up. So it's a really good beer. I can certainly.
It's a good demonstration that this place knows how to brew beer.
It really does.
So 1489 is the next year for us to look at Frederick the Wise, because he's going to raise the castle that's around the castle church.
Now, one of the things that Frederick went on this building spree, and he was building in Wittenberg, he was building in Torgau, he was building all over. Mm-hmm. And this was it's like a works program for the people who were in his jurisdiction.
And he didn't have a place of official residency. He would move among all these castles. Torgau probably ended up being his favorite place because he enjoyed hunting in nearby Lachau. But he tried to spend time in all of his castles, not to show any favoritism in his land.
It's sort of an interesting thing. I mean, going back, I'm always sort of going back and thinking as I read through this stuff, how this is so different than the way we live today. The governor doesn't have to come to, my part of the state. I don't care. If they come here, or the president, I don't care. It's except, it's a traffic jam if the president shows up. But I'm not really I don't get a big wow out of that and I think part of the reason is because communication, I feel like, they don't need to physically be here to
ministry of presence.
Yeah. I mean, it helps, but it was a completely different way of ruling back in those days, where you had to actually be there for a percentage of the time, and you couldn't really have a house that you lived in all the time. You went from place to place to place just to make sure that you made an appearance, that people knew that you were engaged with them.
1489, new castle, new church in Wittenberg is getting built. Not much over the next few years, but in 1494, Frederick becomes the imperial counselor of Emperor Maximilian, moving to Austria to serve.
So, right after that, so he's really gaining more and more power. And this is where it really starts to bear fruit. We talked about how he saved Maximilian 4 or 5 years previously, negotiated his freedom. Well, now he's cashing in those chits. But it was more than just cashing in chits. These guys, both Maximilian and Frederick, really felt, were very, very fond of one another. And they really liked each other.
He uses his ability to kind of develop in the Reichstag of 1495 a caucus, the Party of Freedom, that sought to help kind of fix the regulatory structure of the Holy Roman Empire. And Frederick ended up getting a lot of what he wanted. But then there is also a growing concern that's going to be happening as Frederick and Maximilian are working together. Frederick is very good with money. He's very good with kind of the structure of the politics of nobility. And he'll start to notice that Maximilian is terrible with money and is getting deeper and deeper into debt. And this is going to leave him weakened and unable to accomplish a lot of the things that the Party of Freedom had sought to advance. So they got the kind of the rules passed, but then they lost the ability to implement a lot of what they wanted.
So there were corrupt officials in the emperor's court, and they frustrated all the efforts that Frederick was making to try and get things to be better in the empire. And there was this great example where Frederick negotiated a peace between France and the empire. Now, you have to remember, France, although it was technically part of the empire,
it was his own. You had Spain and you had Netherlands and you had Germany, and kind of in between there was France.
So France actually, and so and they needed to. The emperor wanted to have peace with France. That's right, because France.
It's hard to be at war with your neighbor,
right? And especially when Spain is on the other side of that neighbor. You've got a part of your jurisdiction, on the other side of this unfriendly neighbor. And so Frederick worked hard to negotiate a peace with France. And it was all thrown away in the Chancellery Order of 1498. And at that point, Frederick really felt betrayed.
Both by the French and the imperial court. Right.
Now, the politics of how Frederick got stabbed in the back is really sort of interesting.
Because he wasn't pimping. So the Swabians had some advisors that got influence in Maximilian's court by providing him a steady stream of beautiful women.
Yeah.
At least according to one scholar. So Frederick kind of got pushed out of influence because he wasn't feeding Maximilian's indulgences for
drinking women, right?
For drinking women. So in September 1498, under advice, Maximilian reduced Frederick's power by having much of his decision-making authority transferred for others. The Swabians essentially whispered into Maximilian's ear, "Stop listening to Frederick. Start listening to us.
And we'll give you more women. Yeah.
We'll give you more money and we'll help you in your debt."
Right. And so Frederick got frozen out, and it really, he cooled toward Maximilian. But we shouldn't make too much of this falling out between Maximilian and Frederick. By all accounts, Maximilian was sort of oblivious to what he did.
Yeah. The emperor and another party recognize Frederick in a crowd, waves his hand and says hello, steps down from his throne and kind of grabs Frederick to bring him closer. It's a physical illustration that as much as the politics seem to be separating Frederick from power, Maximilian still sees him as someone to talk to.
And, Spalatin was there, and Spalatin said, this is a miracle because the emperor doesn't act like this. You don't get the emperor waving like a high school, hey, hi, how you doing? And then coming down from his throne to grab Frederick and bring him close to himself. So it was like this really undignified moment. And, it was amazing to the people who were there.
All right, we're getting to a spot where we're going to wind down this episode. We've got just about to the turn of the 1500s. We've introduced Frederick the Wise. We've talked about his brother John and his other brother Albrecht, who's the Bishop of Magdeburg. We looked a little bit at the controversy between Frederick's father and uncle and how that conflict that divided the Saxony between electoral Saxony and ducal Saxony is going to largely shape Frederick's relationship with his brother John, how he's going to keep a strong relationship with John and be very selfless in trying to make sure all of his actions are building up the not only his family, but he's always reaching out to build up the emperor as well. And as we get to the end of this 1400s time period of Frederick, we're going to start to get into the 1500s. And what's notable into the 1500s is he's going to start a college. And that college is really what gets us to talking about Frederick the Wise, because the College of Wittenberg is where Martin Luther is going to become a professor.
So until next time, cheers.